own, in the hope that the gods will do them the same favor. And that's kind of the attitude that my parents had growing up. And so when I was older, I came across a book called The Way That Lives in the Heart by Jean D. Bernardi, who's an anthropologist, and she's now at a Canadian university. And she did some field work in Penang, Malaysia, which is where the book is set, in the 1980s amongst spirit mediums. So she learned Penang Hokkien, which is the local kind of Topolek. She went and talked to people, and she kind of found out about, she kind of researched these religious practices. So I just thought it was really interesting, and it explained a lot about kind of, these things that I kind of grown up around but not fully understood. And when I read the book, I was like, I'm definitely going to write a book about this, but it's just a question of what book it is. So one thing I say about Blackwater Sisters, like, it's being sold as contemporary fantasy, but like on one view, it's not actually fantasy, because basically what I'm writing about, ghosts, gods, and the like, are things that people legit believe in. Like, they're arguably part of reality. It just depends on whose reality you're talking about, right? So yeah, that's how I got into it, and that's why it's although fantasy, I guess, is associated often with historical periods or kind of quasi-historical periods. That's why the book's in a very modern setting. So like, it's set pre-COVID, so I guess 2018, 2019. And so, yeah, it's got, you've got social media, you've got gentrification, you've got all these issues, but it's also got that kind of belief in the spiritual, I guess.
Yeah. That's interesting. I have a question about interpersonal relationships for you later, but first we're going to move on to Fonda Lee, because you actually had to do a whole lot more world building for Jade City and the books that come after it in the Green Bone saga. And the same question, but then how did you apply it to this trilogy?
Yeah. So first of all, the reason why I thought this would be a great topic to talk about is exactly what Zen said. We both ended up writing these books that kind of fall into urban fantasy, or a term that I've heard people say, which is modern with magic. But we got there from very different entry points, and sort of I think it's just fantastic to see right now the boundaries of the subgenre being pushed in different directions, because people are coming at them from these different these different entries. And in the case of the Greenbone saga, I didn't ever set out to write an urban fantasy or a contemporary fantasy. That wasn't what I ever thought of it as. It wasn't until after the book was published and people were asking, well, I'm not sure, like, is this epic fantasy? Is this urban fantasy? And now I see it described as epic urban fantasy, which is kind of what I've been calling it as well. But I intended it, I knew from the start it would be a secondary world that I was going to build from the ground up. And but for me, the default fantasy analogous time period of like pre-modern, medieval-esque just didn't fit at all with the story that I wanted to tell. And it felt very modern in terms of the aesthetic I was trying to create, which was this modernizing metropolis that has this long history, but is kind of being pulled into the modern day by globalization and trade and technology and post-colonialism. And so I also wanted all those things that you associate with the crime drama vibe, right? Like the fancy cars, the Tommy guns, the back alley deals. So all of those things suited the vision of what I was trying to put together. And so I ended up drawing a lot from the epic fantasy narrative, but putting it in a time period that made sense for what I was trying to accomplish. And also because I was drawing very much from the history of Asia and Southeast Asia post-World War II, and that period of just rapid economic growth. And that was, I think, a really fertile period to draw from inspiration. So it ended up being a story that dealt very heavily with all those modern elements mixed with magic. And so I think now, when we think of urban fantasy, there's the sort of the traditional definition of urban fantasy, but I'm not even quite sure what to call sort of the burgeoning subgenre that's broader than what we traditionally think of as, you know, our world, but with werewolves.
Yeah. And was there any particular inspiration while you were creating this particular world for the Greenbone saga? Were there any other media that inspired you from Asia? You mentioned like Asia's growing economies, like within certain parts of Asia. Did anything in particular inspire you?
Well, the island of Kekon is really I wanted to build it from the ground up in a way that made it feel like it was its own place, but was also recognizably East Asian. So that was a delicate balancing act for me, because I was pulling from Hong Kong and Singapore and Taipei and places like that, but also trying to stay away from using words like kimono or dim sum or things that would tie it to our own world. And it's very much a genre mashup, because it is epic fantasy, it's urban fantasy. It draws really heavily from crime fiction, both in Western tradition crime fiction and also Eastern tradition Hong Kong crime drama, Johnny To and John Woo, and you know, all of those film directors. I'm very inspired by film, and also wuxia fiction, and also kung fu flicks. So you know, it really was a lot of things that I wanted to see come together. And I had to sort of I had to create my own template to do that in order to make it feel like it worked organically.
Yeah, because that seems like a very, you know, it's a careful balancing act, I imagine, because there's so many different cultures, there's so many different identities that you're dealing with, that you're still incorporating in this, you know, mishmash that you're building this new world in. But I felt reading that it did still distinctly felt East Asian without, you know, a specific marker going like, okay, this is you know, this is from this country or this is from this country. So how did you what was your philosophy in creating it in such a way? Or was it very hard? Let me just ask that. Maybe it's too broad to say like, oh, but how did you navigate that?
Oh, I think it's hard no matter what you do, right? If you're writing about a real place like Zen is, you know, you have the difficulty of representing that place and being authentic and true to it, and you know, and also, you know, making it feel like it has a certain, you're going to, of course, enter it with a certain perspective, because you as the author have a certain perspective and certain bias, but you need to be respectful and sensitive to like a real place. While on the other side, if you're creating something new, in some regards, okay, it's your own world, like you're God, you can do whatever you like, but you also have the work of being internally consistent, and that's like a whole different challenge, and building something, and I mean, you can make things up, but then you have to keep track of all that. So I think, you know, it's hard regardless, and but you know, it really all depends on what type of story you're trying to tell, and what's right for this particular project.
True. That's interesting. Thank you. Just to go back to you real quick, Zen, but first I'm going to quickly give everyone a reminder. You are free to ask questions in the chat. I will take a gander every now and then at the chat and pick a question to ask both of these lovely writers. So if you have a question, feel free to post them in the chat. Every now and then I will go through it and pick a question to ask. But just to go back now to you, Zen, because in Blackwater Sister, there is a very interesting, very visible family relation when it comes to Jess and her family and the expectations put on, you know, East Asian, Southeast Asian women in this case. and when are you getting married? What kind of job do you have? What kind of, you graduated so high. Why don't you have like a such and such job yet? Do you feel you've drawn that from own experience, or was that something you were just inspired by because you saw it happening around you?
I guess more the latter. I guess I'm really interested in family relationships, and I'm going to do a bit of a plug. Although, like, I'm sure lots of people on this call, probably most, if not all, have read Jade City and Jade War, and are waiting excitedly for Jade Legacy. I'm going to do a pitch for it because I think, for me, like, I have, I would say that, like, I saw the kind of Hong Kong crime movies, like, on the TV, like, because my dad's really into them, but it was never really my thing. But I would say that, like, Greenbone Saga is like a family saga with punching, rather than punching and plus some family stuff. So like, I'm really into the family saga stuff. So it really is completely up my street, and I wouldn't necessarily have thought that if you just told me the elevator pitch. So I'm just gonna pitch that. But yeah, so family dynamics really interesting to me. Jess, kind of the main character, she starts out like she's just graduated. She's she's unemployed. She's kind of feeling like the world's kind of like left her behind a little bit. And I think it's just really like classic kind of place to be when you're when you're that age, early 20s, you're just working out who you are in the world. And I mean, this kind of a unexpected, I guess, element, but a part of it was just like, it was a story about someone kind of coming into her own power and kind of working out who she is and working out how she defines herself independent from her family. And so it was really natural to kind of put her in this position. And it was also really important to me that her parents so at the beginning of the book, Jess moves from America, where she's basically grown up, and lived all her life, back to Malaysia, which is where her parents were from, because her parents have had a tough few years. They've had illness, they've kind of had redundancies, they've lost a little bit of money. So they're kind of retreating to Malaysia, where their relatives are providing support. So the kind of an American dream has kind of gone sour for them. And Jess is kind of going at them to provide support. And it was important to me that she had that kind of burden, in a way, that she's like, it's part of like becoming an adult, realizing that your parents aren't omnipotent, and you have your kind of, you have kind of obligations to them in the same, and to kind of look after them the way they looked after you. So that's kind of an additional challenge for her. And the inspiration, part of the inspiration was like, when I was writing my second book, I watched Yuri on Ice, the anime, and Yuri. Yuri, at the beginning, he's so relatable. Like he's an ice skater. He's just had a huge kind of failure. He doesn't really know what to do with his life, and he's just kind of trying to put things together. And I thought that's a really kind of like, I don't know, narratively, I think I was like, this is such an appealing character, because so many people will watch this and be like, they'll identify with that sense of powerlessness and aimlessness in, a really complex world. Maybe that's part of why, maybe it really fits with the modern fantasy as well. It's being set in the modern world, because I think the world's so big and so complex now, it's quite common to feel adrift. And then in fantasy, maybe it's quite, it's kind of the classic fantasy. You have a role, you're in a society that's like, you're born to a certain station or whatever, and then you move from that station to another station. And obviously in the modern world, it's just not that simple. You don't get born as a farm boy and become the king eventually. It's just, even the fantasies that you have, your wish fulfillment fantasies, are more complex than that.
True. Yeah. No, that is good. By the way, I'm also a Yuri on Ice fan. In the moment you said Yuri on Ice, my head went to like, we were born to make history.
It's such a good series.
It is. But we have some questions from the audience. Sorry, I'm cutting myself off here. So for both Fonda and Zen, how do you decide how much magical fantasy elements to include in a grounded story? And we'll start with you, Fonda.
Gosh, I think that like it's really instinctive in a way, and it boils down to, what's your vision for this world, and like how on the spectrum of magic, where do you want to plant yourself? Because I could see a version of my book that was highly, magic with a lot more magical elements to it, but that wasn't the story I wanted to tell, because like Zen said, the focus of this book is it's a family saga. And I've always wanted to write, when I write my action scenes and my martial arts scenes, I always want them to feel very real and very grounded. And I think that comes from being a martial artist myself, that I've always wanted to write things that feel as viscerally realistic as possible. So I wanted to basically take all the like really high flying, like over the top martial arts that I saw in these kung fu movies and make them feel super grounded and incorporate them into the world in a way that felt very natural. And for example, a creative decision I made was that the characters never use the word magic. Like there is the substance, this jade that they wear that gives them these powers, but that's not in their world. That's not magic. That's just part of their natural world. They don't think of it as magic. And it's just something that isn't fully understood. Just like, there's lots of things in our world that aren't fully understood. And so that was part of my goal, to make K-Con and make John Loon and make these, everything that happened feel as real as possible. I really wanted this place to feel like it, even though it was a secondary world, that it was a secondary world that was extremely recognizable. And like that was something that I loved about Zen's Blackwater Sister as well, was like it's like because the blurring between religion and spirituality and magic is so prevalent, that it's not like the characters aren't calling it magic. Like they, it's just part of their natural world. It's just part of their accepted reality. And that I think gives a certain flavor to the fantasy that maybe makes it, differentiates it from sort of the traditional high fantasy where like the people actually call it magic and there's spells and, wizards and so on. This to me feels much more of a intimate story in a way, because you're making the fantasy elements more of an enabler than like the focus of the story.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Same for you, Zen.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I'm writing, what I'm always kind of looking to do is kind of represent like an emotional truth. And I think writing fantasy seems to give me that kind of scope. And when it comes to Blackwater Sister, I mean, I kind of said this already, but it gets read as fantasy, it gets marketed as fantasy. Arguably, it isn't fantasy. I think what we believe in about the world and the things we don't fully understand, it's really interesting to me. And all of these things that I represent in Blackwater Sister, spirit mediums, they're slightly punched up. They're punched up slightly. They're like amended slightly for kind of fictional effect. But like a lot of the stuff like I'm talking about, like they're just like 100% like, real life. I mean, that's just what people do, like you go to a spirit medium, you might ask a god some questions, you like believe in ghosts. So I had this fairly entertaining, I mean, it's a really tragic incident, but there was an incident a couple of years ago now where a young girl with learning difficulties, she was visiting Malaysia with her family, and they stayed in a kind of jungle resort, I guess. And she, when they woke up in the morning, the girl was gone. Like the windows opened, there weren't any tracks of anyone, and she was just lost. And they found her body some weeks later. And it's still a mystery. Nobody knows what happened. But I was talking to it was a big deal in the Malaysian press. And I was talking to my best friend about it. My best friend is, university educated. She's got like a kind of like big corporate job. She's working in Switzerland at the moment. And we were talking about it, and she was like, well, obviously it was, some supernatural thing happened, like, like some like spirits in the jungle spirited her away. And I was like, oh, okay. So that's what you believe.
Oh, wow.
And she was like, and she was really shocked that I don't believe in spirits. My attitude in spirits is like, I don't believe in them, but then I kind of am slightly worried that they don't care whether I believe in them or not. So, so that's kind of my position. But like, she's just like straight up. She's like, like, yeah, of course ghosts are a thing. Like people wouldn't say that ghosts exist if they didn't, So I think like for me, like telling a true story about Malaysia, it will often just have supernatural elements because it's pretty ghostly place. We got a lot of spirits.
Superstitions of galore.
Yeah. I mean, I also love the fact that when Jess is haunted, by her grandma, you think, oh, like, I don't know, like, I feel like if in the sort of predictable thing with a grandma spirit coming to visit you would be, oh, like they're, a guardian angel, or, they're like here to, like, I don't know, look over their grandchildren, or like, you imagine that, no, but I love the fact that, like, no, these ancestors, like the ancestor spirit of your grandma, she's a vindictive hag and she's going to F up your life. And like, it felt so, just so relatable and real.
But that's the thing. Isn't there like a certain truth about that? Like if my like forebears are gonna come and haunt me, it's because they want to like order me around. They're gonna have some ideas about how even the living ones have a lot of ideas about how I should live my life. So why would that change once you're dead?
True. So true.
Exactly.
Very relatable. Fonda, I quickly want to go back to you because before we talked with Zen about all the different relationships in Blackwater Sister, but Jade City has all these different clans and so many intricate relationships going on. And as we talked about it before, like you had to do like a whole world building outside of the earth that we know. And on top of that, you have all these clans interacting with each other. How did you go about creating all those relationships, and how did you go about it? Let me just ask it like that.
Well, I knew from the start that this story was going to be a family saga.
Yeah.
And so what that meant for me was coming up with the family members and the relationships that would kind of drive the story. And so I started really with broad strokes archetypes. So when I came up with the idea for Jade City, I didn't have any characters. I had no plot. I just had the idea for the world, the concept, and the vibe of the place, which is unusual for me. So because I knew that the family was going to be the center of the story, these broad brush archetype characters were my starting point, right? Like the responsible eldest brother, the hot-headed like middle child, the black sheep of the family, the patriarch. So like I kind of had these very sort of stock character roles, and then the whole process of writing the book was like was digging to find out the real people and all of their sort of internal contradictions, their relationships, the history, and then building that, because I knew this was going to be a multiple POV book, and that the way into this family and into the world was seeing it through the different angles of these different characters that sort of represented different aspects of their family and their relationship to Jade. And so what happens when you write the book is you start out with these characters who you've created to play certain roles, and then over time they develop and they become more like real people. And then through the revision process, you might have a scene that starts off where two people are having a conversation and it's very like surface level, like let's get through the plot kind of situation. But no one really talks like that in real life. Like you don't ever have a real conversation with someone where you're like, I can't believe you slept with my sister-in-law, something like, no one says that, right? And so you go from having sort of these broad brush characters to ones that have such a rich history that you can write a scene where a lot is communicated in subtext, or just a moment of them glancing at each other, or you can communicate a lot more once you know these characters really well. And that was really my challenge with this whole series, was making all of these characters and their relationships and the way they evolve over the story feel true and real, and keeping them all like moving at the same time, because there are so many points at which the story's moving along and there's multiple points of view. So I have to make decisions at each narrative turning point of who's the best character to be telling us this right now.
That's so great. And just to follow up on that, because you just recently finished it's not out yet, but you finished the third book, Legacy.
Yes.
How was that experience? Because now you have all these characters come together to a close, basically, to finalize your story, without giving any spoilers, obviously. But how was that experience of like, okay, I'm done. This is the final book.
I'm a little dazed. I'm not quite sure like how I feel yet, because on one hand I'm like, oh, thank God it's over. On the other hand, I'm like, oh, I'm excited, I get to write new projects now. And yet there's also a very large part of me that feels so sad to leave the story. And I know these characters so well, and I know the world so well, that writing anything new, I'm like, who are these people? I don't know these people.
Do I have to start new people?
Yeah, exactly. Do I have to start a new book? What is going on? So I'm really excited. I mean, it comes out November 30th, so there's still like quite a long time for me to emotionally reconcile myself.
Good to hear. Good to hear. But do you also have this sense of, okay, I've done it. I've given everybody their story. Like the stories are done. I'm done telling this story. Or do you feel like maybe there's a little bit more, like a spin-off or something coming out? Or do you like, no, for now I'm done?
Yeah, the Greenbone Saga, as it stands now, is the story I wanted to tell and is complete. Okay. There is going to be a spin-off novella, which is totally different characters. That takes place before Jade City. And that was fun to write because I needed like a shorter project to reset my brain. And there'll be like little bits of short fiction here and there, but yes.
Awesome.
Feeling good.
Okay, well, I can't wait till November, I can tell you that. But I'm still halfway through the second book, so I'm savoring my time till the last one comes out. To go back to you real quick, Zen, because Fonda had an awesome question, which I am very curious about as well, and that is how you balanced humor and suspense in Blackwater Sister, how you went about it, and how you felt like how did you just balance it in general for the main character specifically? We touched upon it just before, like being possessed by your grandma and all the stuff that comes with that, and all the different superstitions that live in Malaysia. So where did you find the way to balance that out with each other?
Oh, I don't know. I guess for me, like my like temperamentally, I just like jokes, and I like I'm just like I don't think I can really write anything. Well, I can write things that aren't funny, but then I always feel like a failure. Like I'll read the story, be like, it's not funny, like and so it just doesn't seem right to me. I think it just doesn't fit with my worldview in a way. And I think one of my big things is that even if everything's really shit, there's no reason not to kind of laugh. In fact, that's all the more reason. And so I guess that's just like a fairly natural part of my narrative voice. I think if I was trying to keep things serious, that just wouldn't really work at all. So in terms of suspense though, like I do feel with Blackwater Sister, like I'm really pleased with it because I feel like I've leveled up in terms of plotting and pacing. I think there was a question in the chat, which is like, what are you jealous about the other writers in the other writers writing? And like one of the things I'm really jealous of Fonda over, or like that I really admire in her work, is kind of her like skills and kind of plotting and pacing, and like there's such exciting books, and that's something that didn't come naturally to me at all. But Blackwater Sister, I think, is generally pretty good in terms of like plotting and pacing by my standards. So that's something I'm proud of, and I guess that's just a matter of craft. I guess you just you write a couple of novels and you kind of work it out as you go along. And like my main thing was like stuff needs to keep happening, like in each scene something needs to happen, basically. Which sounds really basic, but like when you're first starting out, it's not necessarily obvious how you make that work. I'm gonna say like other things I really like about Fonda's writing as well, since I brought up the question anyway. I really admire her fight scenes. I think that that's something I think is really cool, and again, not something that comes naturally to me. And I think like the best fight scenes are, you know, it's a fight, but then it means something in the context of the story, and for the characters, you know, it's emotionally, it has significance. And I think Fonda always kind of brings that. So yeah, so there are like other things I could but I'll kind of leave that there.
Well, I asked the question about humor because that was the thing I was immediately like, that's what I'm so jealous of in your work, is the voice. If you guys haven't read Blackwater, I mean, first of all, if you're attending this, you should just buy Blackwater Sister. I don't know why you're here if you're not going to. So, but first of all, the whole time I was reading that book, the voice is so strong, and I was like laughing like out loud, like every second page. My husband was like, "What are you reading? Why is it so funny?" But like that I think is one of those things that I think is hardest to explain to a writer. Like, how do you get voice? Like, how do you what is voice even? Like, but you know it. It's like one of those things. It's like, you know, it's a duck when you see it, and that's the same with voice. I just feel like Zen, your voice in this book is so strong and funny. Like but Jess is such a I think a wonderful, relatable character, but it's the voice and it's that her sense of humor that like puts it over the top.
Thank you.
Yeah. That makes it really connect. I'm going back to check real quick for questions. There's a lot of praise for both of you in the chat, by the way. So if you need to see happy people about your books, they're really, really excited here. Owen is talking about the fight scene at the climax of Jade City and how it made them gasp out loud. And we were just talking about a little bit, as Zen mentioned, that, you know, the fighting scenes in Jade City and the Green Bone Saga in general, they all have like some type, nothing is meaningless. No one's like, oh, okay, let's fight like Mortal Kombat style, standing against each other and like, fatality. So, and you've mentioned your martial arts background. Was it with purpose that you no, let me rephrase that. Is it with did you construct the martial arts scenes to specifically elevate certain moments, or did it go the other way around? Like, okay, I want some type of tension or suspense to come in at this particular point in the story, and this is the way that they can best resolve it. And maybe a weird way of asking it. Sorry, I'm thinking in Dutch and translating to English, but the way I wanted to ask is like, when did you feel in which moments of conflict in the book that the martial arts scenes fitted in best? How did you go about choosing those moments?
I mean, it's hard to say because the fight scenes are so they're so vital and tied to the overall narrative. I think a mistake sometimes that writers make is they're like, well, this part is a little boring, we should throw in a fight scene. And you know, that's you can tell when a fight scene is not necessary, like if you take it out and nothing has really changed about the characters and story, then the fight scene is just kind of it's just superfluous. So when I plan out the narrative, there's a story is a series of parts where you're growing tension and releasing tension. Right? Yeah. So you're building up towards certain situations in which there's going to be conflict, or that tension is going to be resolved or changed or escalated in some way. And so you're always playing this dance with the reader's expectations and with the level of tension in your story. And so when where it makes sense, like there's multiple times where it makes sense for this to escalate into physical conflict. It might escalate into a tense interpersonal conversation. It might escalate into a strategic a backroom deal in a boardroom, like whichever, I sort of approach them the same way. I don't necessarily think, okay, this is, I need a fight scene here, and then I need a fight scene here. I sort of think
exactly.
like, what's like the natural outcome? Like, where is this going? Given the nature of the story I'm telling, sometimes it resolves with like a gangland style execution, and sometimes it's like a traditional duel with knives, and so I that's how I just think of like fight scenes and action scenes as narrative turning points. They're just like any other one, although they're incredibly fun to write. They're like the candy for me. I'm like, okay, I can get through this scene because I know there's a fight scene coming up.
I get that. I'm personally, I'm a big fan of Hong Kong action movies, and also stuff like Infernal Affairs and such. And for me, some parts of the book like really felt like those movies that I grew up watching, like the feel, like how people interacted with each other, and gangsters among each other. And so it was really interesting to go through that experience, definitely. But that was something I was curious about. Are there questions from the audience? Because the chat has not shown anything new, but we are definitely open to pick up some more questions. We have another
questions. There are a few questions that we haven't answered.
Hold on. Yes.
Just scrolling back, this one about, are there any magical creatures you'd like to write about or include in a future book? Do you want to give that one a go, Fonda?
Yes,
so I actually have a novella that is not announced that has magic creatures, so I can't talk about it yet, but yes.
Can you not even hint like what the magic creature is? Has it got fur, feathers?
It has feathers.
Okay. that's very enticing. I like that. Okay. How
about you, Zen?
Well, for me, like, story ideas don't I did have a period where I'd be like, I was going through all the hantu is like a Malay word for like kind of like spirit demon, and I was kind of going through them, and I'd write a short story about each one, but like I kind of have done that now. So for me, like my kind of story ideas just are more based on like, there's always kind of like a dynamic I want to explore, and then there's a setting I want to explore. So it's not really, and then the magic will kind of come in as and when needed, but it's not really like necessarily like a magical creature that I want to feature. We've done qualities of writing. Sorry.
Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, I know. I can see that question. This one I really like. So both of you, what qualities of writing makes you jealous of the other?
I think we hit that one.
Oh, I think we did that one already.
Yeah.
We did one already?
Yeah, I just picked it up. Sorry, I just got ahead of myself.
Zen was like 2 steps ahead of us.
I was so busy trying to find all the different questions. I was like, did I ask that one? I'm not sure anymore. I am so sorry. Hold on. Let me scroll this a little bit and see. Okay. The book. Oh, this is for Zen. I've not asked this. In the book, Jess picks up Hokkien and even Malay through being haunted by her grandma. This person is wondering if you can comment about that and how Jess is learning to navigate the world in Penang.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I think like, so in the book, basically Jess speaks Hokkien to her parents, but not really to anyone else. So her Hokkien's not great. And then she speaks English, obviously, because she's basically American. And then she goes back to Penang, and her grandma starts haunting her. And so her Hokkien magically gets better. And then she also picks up some Malay because her grandma could speak Malay. And I think for me, these are just like fantasies of like being really like, you automatically like good at these languages, because and actually
most magical part
right but it's a fantasy. I mean, the whole thing in a way, like having Ama in her head, her grandma's terrible, but it's also kind of a fantasy of like being able to connect so directly with a part of your family and your heritage that you are cut off from, and that you just magically have this understanding, of course, because in the book she's awful and she's trying to get Jess to do all these things that Jess doesn't want to do. Like, Jess isn't happy about that. But to write it is kind of like a fantasy of making this like kind of almost healing the kind of, I don't know, the breach of being diaspora in a way. And then so Jess's kind of journey back from the US kind of it kind of reflects, it draws on my life. So when I was but a different part of my life. So when I was a kid, we went to America. So my mom, the way that my mom tells the story is absolutely hilarious. So basically she's like, well, we were kind of a bit worried about the political situation in Malaysia. And then in the newspaper, they advertised the green card lottery for America. And your dad always spins things in the newspaper, like it's a rice cooker, right? Like he's just like, join some competition. And then, so we applied and they called us for interview. And then we all got green cards. So off we went to America. So which is ridiculous. You think of like how people are just killing themselves, over like a protracted period of time to get green cards, and we all just sort of won it through the newspaper. Anyway, so we went to America, and I was about like 5, 6, and we stayed there for about like a year and a half, I would say. And then, and it just didn't really work out. Like my dad couldn't really get jobs. Like, he just like kind of struggled, and yeah, we just, and it wasn't working out. And then there was an opportunity back in Kuala Lumpur for him. And so he started like traveling back and forth. And then my mom was like, oh, she actually said what Justice Mom says in the first scene, which is she was like, oh, like you drew this picture of your father, flying away. I thought, wow, the kids are going to get complex. So she decided to bring us all back home. She was like, the family shouldn't be apart. And actually we did way better in Malaysia. Like my dad's company did really well. I would say like my family was much, much better off financially for having gone back to Malaysia, which I think is really interesting because it's kind of the flip side of that, again, that kind of classic immigrant narrative. But so when we went back to Malaysia, the first thing we did, actually, we went to Penang. We didn't actually move back to Kuala Lumpur because we had relatives there. And we actually did stay in my aunt's house. And I think it was that kind of, then they sent me to Chinese school and I had to learn Malay and I had to learn Mandarin because I didn't speak, I spoke English at home, and like all of this shit was happening. So I think in a way, just like magically picking up Hokkien and Malay is like this fantasy, like, oh, how great that would be. Like if I could just go back, it would just like be downloaded into my brain,
Yeah, exactly. Like, bloop, and I speak Hokkien now. Yes, yeah.
But the price is you get this horrible.
You get haunted by your grandmother.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, magic has costs.
There's another question. I'm going to ask that first to you, Fonda. What kind of scenes were the hardest for you to write, and how do you tackle them? It's for both of you, but we'll start with Fonda.
I mean, they're all hard. I don't really know.
Okay. Yeah.
There are scenes that I find easier. Like I do find fight scenes, and I do find those relatively fun. I guess I know some people struggle with them, but I find them fun. Hardest scenes. I think the hardest scenes are the ones that are really tense, careful, interpersonal confrontations, in the sense that like there's scenes that I find myself going over and writing like over and over again to try and get the tone just right, because there's two characters or there's multiple characters and they are having an interaction in which I'm trying to just like nail the flavor of the emotional situation. And I've had many of these scenes where you end up stripping as much out as you can in order to get to the heart of the emotional interaction that is happening there. And it might be like a tense negotiation, it might be an emotional confrontation, it might be just one in which like a character is very vulnerable. So I think the really like meaty like feelings scenes are the ones that require the most care.
That's so interesting to me, because for me the action scenes are the ones I dread, and then the ones where there's interpersonal stuff I'm like, yeah, I know exactly what everyone's going to say. Like, it just comes. Like, honestly, I don't even have to think about it. Like, you just put the characters in a room and they'll do it. But yeah, for me, I think the hardest scenes to write are the ones where I just don't really know enough. So like action scenes are hard for me because I don't, I'm not a martial artist. I'm not like, and I'm not particularly interested in action scenes in movies and stuff. So to make it feel like realistic and exciting, that's really difficult. I have like a scene. I mean, this is such a mundane answer, but there's a scene in the book where Jess goes to a construction construction site, and like and witnesses something horrible that the goddess of the title does, Blackwater Sister, and that really stressed me out because like I don't know anything about construction sites. So my dad worked in construction sites a lot, in the course of his career. So I had like several kind of FaceTime calls with him, just like, being like, hey, talk me through what's something that could happen, what's something terrible that could happen, how could you prevent it, how would you, and yeah, so that gave me a lot of grief. I think it's kind of whether you feel you kind of know enough that you can kind of envision it,
Yeah. Just as a follow-up question to your answer, Fonda, about interpersonal relationships and writing that and how you tackled that, because I saw someone else ask or say they really love the calls, especially Hilo.
Hilo can get it. Hilo can get it. I would 100% vote him.
Hilo. Okay. Oh, man.
I'm not sure if Steven feels the same way, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask a question about Hilo in a bit for all the thirsty people, but there's some pretty bad things happen to them during the book, sometimes also in a way that feels like a tragedy. Did you plan or outline their bad luck ahead, or did it evolve organically while writing, especially since we were talking about interpersonal writing for interpersonal relationships?
Both. Sometimes they are absolutely planned ahead. Like I know that this is a big the midpoint of Jade City, for example, that was a turning point that I knew right from the beginning would happen. So sometimes they are planned because that I know that the story is going to go there. And then the hard work is setting up everything ahead so that it feels extremely inevitable yet surprising when it happens. And then there are other times when what happens comes more organically or as a surprise to me as a result of consequences, things that happen in the story. And then, like something will happen and I'll be like, oh yeah, but that's not going to be the end of that. Like there's going to be consequences down the line later, or so both.
Okay, good to know. And then important follow-up question, because Sen also mentioned it, like Hilo can get it. If you would cast Hilo, who do you have in mind?
Seen like enough fan casts now that I don't know.
Did you start out with one, or was that not?
I mean, I didn't start out with one. At some point, people started fan casting Lewis Tan, which I was like, okay.
Some of my objection to the Hilo fan art and fan casts, though, it's like I don't think he should be too pretty,
Right.
I think he needs to be like a kind of quite rugged. That's my opinion. Yeah,
rough around the edges.
Yeah,
absolutely.
He's a guy who's been in a lot of fights. Like
right, exactly. He's
not going to be delicate,
Yeah. I actually, one thing I forgot, I was thinking with the kind of what do you admire in the other person's writing, and I knew I had something else to say, which is your ruthlessness. That's something I really admire, because like as you say, the midpoint of Jade City, it was really when I was kind of like, oh, it's that kind of book.
I'm almost a little worried about like Jade Legacy and whether it will like live up to like just the number of people who expect like
honestly if you're nicer to the characters than we expect, I personally will be extremely happy. Like
that's good. I think I threaded the line well. We'll see.
I'm sure you did. I'm sure it's
We'll see in November. But I expect it to be awesome, whichever way it goes.
I think one of the things you said earlier, Zen, was what was like sparked something for me, which is like we were each talking about like different scenes that we found more difficult to write, and it's always interesting to hear what other authors think is harder or easier to write, because at the end of it, like you can't tell. Like you can. I'm always sort of a little bit shocked by that, because there's definitely times I'm like, oh my gosh, the scene is like taking forever. It's so hard. It's like I don't know, ever gonna get through this. But then at the end of the day, like it all. Like you can't really remember and you can't really tell, and that's it's part of the magic of it, that like some parts are just, they're so hard, and some parts feel like they're flying, and at the end it's all just a blur in your mind, and it reads the same.
True. Since we're an hour has already flown by, it feels we're in our last few minutes. If anybody in the audience wants to throw some more questions our way, do please let us know. I'm going to scroll also to see if I missed anything big or anything that wasn't already answered in the convo that we have.
There was, I think I saw one comment in here about diaspora, which was something that I'm on the lookout for, and I loved in Zen's book, is like, you don't see cultural diaspora represented that much in traditional fantasy, because there's so much fantasy where it's like these people have lived in this kingdom for like ever and ever, and like the blood right goes back like 10,000 years or whatever, and like that was something that I really wanted to explore in J4, was like and so much a part of like our modern life, right? Like people aren't living in, generally they live in the same town that they grew up in for their family for 300 years. Like people are so mobile and they move, and there's so much just like work and marriage and life that like moves you around the globe, and that's just a function of our world now, and something that I love to see represented. I think more traditionally has been represented in science fiction, because there are all these stories of people leaving Earth and like the culture and how it evolves when it gets to other planets. And seeing that in fantasy is just it's my jam. I love that in Blackwater Sister.
Thank you.
True. I am quickly scrolling. It's annoying for me because I'm working on 2 screens, but the chat is very small, so please bear with me.
There's one question people seem interested in, which is you, from Owen Blacker, you've both written about LGBTQ plus characters in your world. Were there aspects of writing queer characters that you hadn't expected, things that were easier, more difficult, or just more interesting than you'd anticipated? Fonda, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Honestly, my approach to writing Andon, who is one of the main characters in the Greenbone saga and is gay, was just to treat him like any other character. And it's his sexual orientation is certainly part of who he is, and is very much like part of his history, how he sees the world and like how he sees himself. But it's only one aspect of his identity, along with the fact that he's biracial, that he's an orphan, that he was adopted into this family, that he was raised as a greenbone to wield jades. Like all those elements are part of who he is, and so I guess the answer to that is that not really, because I didn't find him any easier or harder to write than any other character. Because I was just trying to make him as 3-dimensional as I could.
Yeah.
I think for me, just as sexuality is obviously, the book starts with her grandmother saying to her, "Does your mom know you're gay?" essentially. And then and the journey, her journey is to bring her to the point where she can answer that question, in a way that kind of is right for her. So it was just kind of bait into the concept, I think, and that was kind of inspired by my own experience, but it was also inspired by like stuff in my family where like I've got queer relatives, and kind of like how that was accepted or not accepted amongst the older generation particularly, and kind of the impact on family dynamics. So I'm really interested in family as kind of both the kind of good side and the dark side, and I think something like queerness actually really kind of exposes kind of pushes family as far as it can go, perhaps particularly in Asian cultures. And so that was something I was really interested in exploring. I think, and it was really fun as well. Like it just like like kind of working out. I don't know, because it's a book that's mostly about kind of like just with her family. There's all this kind of like fun like stuff that I couldn't really explore. Like my headcanon is that like Jess is one of those like Asian Americans who mostly hangs out with other Asians, and then like her girlfriend, who's Indian Singaporean American, is one of those queer people who mostly hang out with queer people, so most of her friends are white. So so I have this whole thing going on, but there's no evidence of that in the book. Anyway, but I think in terms of what like how it differs from my expectation is that when I was writing it, because I was just really involved in the story, and I was like, this is a story that needs to be that it needs to be. And I wasn't really thinking about the external reception. I think one thing I've just been struggling a little bit about is kind of like when you have that kind of how people like perceive it, there's obviously a lot of kind of like discussion on like, online about like, whether you have the right, the kind of right that one has to write certain experiences and so on. And I think that's something that I kind of, that tension between, how much of yourself you put out there and what kind of like, what kind of justification you offer. I think the justification is in the book. Like if you read the book and you think it did a crap job of like, dealing with like queer experiences, then fine. Like, but I don't necessarily think that like, say, my personal kind of like who I am or what I've gone through is relevant. But that's obviously, there's obviously disagreement on that.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, I'm queer Southeast Asian myself, and I have my sibling, my younger sibling, is also they're a different mix. I'm Indian Egyptian. They're Japanese Indonesian Indian, which is a different mix, but also Southeast Asian. And them being younger than I am, I had to deal with like the Asian aunties, coming after me and asking questions and being weird, whereas I think my youngest sibling is more like the girlfriend in this story who more hangs with them, white people, more with queer people, that makes it easier because, you don't have to deal with all the aunties. And so, but it was very, very relatable when I went through that. It was like, I don't know, this makes sense. I understand. There is one last question before, because we're already a little bit over time, but that's not an issue. When will we ever get I cannot. Shararins, or is it Shararin? Yeah.
Sharanya.
POV story.
Sharanya is the girlfriend of the main character.
Yeah.
So I just put my answer in the chat, which is for the fanfic writers to tell.
Mine is still updating. Yes, that's for the fanfic writers. Perfect. Then I'm going to call back up Luke and Timon. And first of all, thank you both for this amazing conversation. I hardly needed to step in or say anything because the two of you have so much to tell and are so open to talk to us about this. And at one point I was like, I want to grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and just listen to the two of you talk to each other for like hours on end. You could start a podcast and I would be a subscriber, definitely.
I mean, Zen and I we could talk about, anime, wuxia, like, it would be like an hour and a half later.
Yeah, I love it. The chemistry between the two of you is amazing. So if you ever think of doing, a crossover, universe or anything like that, do let me know.
That would be so good. Fonda, you could just do the fight scenes.
Deal.
You can do the plot. I would just do the feelings and the banter.
That sounds good.
Well, you do complement each other in that way, so that would really work. No, I love this.
Yes. Wow, thank you. This has been amazing, wonderful, exhilarating, and watching the whole thing and hearing you all guys with your opinions and stuff like that. Thank you so much for turning up. I'm pretty sure that everyone has, they've been rooted to the spot because they ain't nobody left and people only just joined. So that's a good thing. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for doing this.
Thanks, everyone.
We're streaming it on live on YouTube, but it will be up on YouTube again if people want to watch it again. And we've come to the end.
Yes.
All things have to come to the end. Timon, you got anything extra that you want to add?
Yeah, although this is the end of this event, we're organizing more events and we can already announce our next events for next month. And that will be a Q&A with Christopher Paolini, the author of the Aragon series. And that will be... Oh God, I should have prepared this. Next month in June
18th.
18th of June, if I'm not correct. Yeah, June 18th at the same time.
It will be. I'm just going to put in a little, because I can. There you go. I put the link in the chat box. So thank you to Zencho, to Fonda Lee for turning up, and thank you for Rabia for moderating everything. This has been wonderful, and thanks for everybody for turning up and watching, and all your questions as well in the chats. And we'll see you hopefully at the next one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
and congrats, Zen, on the launch of Blackwater Sister. Everyone, go buy it.
Buy both, really. And in November, definitely. Wait, I don't know which one. Wait, the Legacy. Go get all the books. Get all the books.
Yeah.
I have one question actually. Somebody asked about an ebook for Blackwater Sister. That should be coming soon, shouldn't it?
That should be available on the usual ebook sites, and I think yeah.
I didn't see it on our site yet, but we'll get that sorted out. But we will do that. All right then.